Imagine this. It's 1968. The Beatles, the greatest band in the world, are in the recording studio working on what will turn out to be the iconic White Album. But things are amiss. Tension runs high, egos are battling, and in the midst of it all, a new player enters the scene. A woman who would transform the Beatles once and for all. Her name? Yoko Ono. And for one Beatle, Paul McCartney in particular, her presence wasn't just an annoyance, it was personal. So personal that even years after the fact, at the age of 82, Paul McCartney is at last opening up about why he never was able to entirely forgive her. Why did Paul hate Yoko so much? Was she actually the one who had broken up the Beatles? And what's the real story behind their long-standing feud? Stay with me for a fascinating look at one of music's most tangled love triangles, Paul, John, and Yoko, and a tale that could rewrite everything you thought you knew about the Beatles' acrimonious split. Let's dive in. Back to the start. To know why Paul McCartney and Yoko Ono fought, we must take it back to the start, when the Beatles were unstoppable. It's the early 1960s, and four Liverpudlian lads, John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr, are rewriting music history. They're more than a band. They're a cultural earthquake. Beatlemania is sweeping the world. Fans screaming at the tops of their voices, sold-out concerts, and hits like I Want to Hold Your Hand and She Loves You topping the charts. But offstage, the Beatles were more than a band. They were a fraternity. And the epicenter of that fraternity was John Lennon and Paul McCartney's songwriting duo. Their bond was electric, Lennon's tough edge tempered by McCartney's melodic brilliance. Collectively, they wrote songs that didn't only lead chart-topping hits, songs that altered the songwriting process. But how did this immaculate partnership begin to crumble? Let's go back to where Paul first began. James Paul McCartney was born on June 18, 1942, in Liverpool's Walton Hospital, where his mother, Mary, was a nurse. Paul came from a working-class background with music running through its veins. His father, Jim, a one-time jazz band leader, filled the house with piano tunes. Life, however, was not always smooth. World War II struck hard, and Jim had long hours at a defense factory, while Mary, a midwife, became the principal breadwinner for the family. Then came the tragedy. In 1956, when Paul was only 14, his mother passed away from an embolism following breast cancer surgery. That loss made him deeply upset, but it also united him with John Lennon, who also lost his own mother, Julia, 2 years later in a terrible accident. Was it this common sorrow that might have been the ignition to spark their powerful partnership? Paul was a born musician. He learned to play the guitar himself, listening to American rock and roll and his idol's Little Richard. He met John Lennon when he was 15 at a church fete in Woolton on July 6, 1957. John was leading a skiffle band, the Quarrymen, and Paul was impressed. He joined as the rhythm guitarist soon, and George Harrison joined a year later. By 1960, with drummer Pete Best and Stuart Sutcliffe on bass, they were the Beatles. Hamburg was their testing ground. Long nights, sleazy clubs, and round-the-clock gigs toughened them into a slick, dynamic act. By 1962, Ringo Starr had replaced Pete Best, and their manager, Brian Epstein, provided the finishing touches. Their first single, Love Me Do, made it onto the airwaves, and by 1964, Beatlemania had taken America by storm. Paul, with his schoolboy looks, was named the cute Beatle, but he was so much more, a musical visionary taking the band to new heights. By 1966, the Beatles were spent. Beatlemania was a two-edged sword. It brought wealth and admiration, but also unceasing pressure. They abandoned touring after a disastrous San Francisco show and retreated to the studio to produce masterpieces such as Revolver and Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Paul was emerging as the band's creative leader, co-arranging songs and insisting on daring experiments such as Eleanor Rigby and Yesterday. But fissures were developing. John was getting deeper into drugs, George was feeling bypassed, and Paul's perfectionism was beginning to annoy. Then in August of 1967, a bitter blow, Brian Epstein, their manager and guiding light, died of an accidental overdose. Who would keep the Beatles together without Brian? Paul took on the leadership role, but it didn't work easily. And into this vulnerable time came Yoko Ono. Yoko Ono. Her very name provokes argument among Beatles enthusiasts. Was she the bad girl who tore apart the greatest band in history? Or merely a woman in the middle of a band already coming apart at the seams? To comprehend her influence, we must learn about Yoko and why her presence was an earthquake to Paul McCartney. What did Yoko do to alter everything? Yoko Ono was 33 when she encountered John Lennon in November 1966. A Japanese-American conceptual artist, she was already causing a stir in New York's avant-garde world with pieces such as Cut Piece and Grapefruit. She was not your average rock star chick girlfriend. She was daring, cerebral, and unapologetically experimental. When John saw her show at London's Indica Gallery, it all clicked. Theirs wasn't instant love, it was a meeting of minds. John was troubled, looking for something more than Beatlemania. Yoko provided a fresh perspective, a way out of the Fab Four bubble. By 1968, after John's disillusioning journey to India with the Maharishi to study meditation, John left his wife Cynthia and started dating Yoko. But what would this new romance do to the Beatles? Here's where it gets ugly. The Beatles had a sacred law: no girlfriends or wives in the studio. It was their creative hallowed ground, where they could be raw, honest, and intense. But when John began taking Yoko to recording sessions for the White Album in 1968, that law was broken. Yoko wasn't merely present, she was vocal, giving opinions, even escorting John to the lavatory. For Paul, George, and Ringo, this was a culture shock. Why did John subvert the rules for Yoko? Paul, who was struggling to maintain the band following Epstein's passing, was particularly sensitive to the intrusion. He would later refer to Yoko's visit as workplace interference on the McCartney, A Life in Lyrics podcast. Historian Robert Rodriguez suggests that Yoko viewed Paul as her competitor, not only musically, but emotionally. She even spoke about recording her ideas regarding the band, stating that if Paul were female, she'd be jealous of him. Was this a love triangle among Paul, John, and Yoko? The White Album sessions were strained. Paul was demanding perfection, George was infuriated, and John was sidetracked by Yoko. The band was disintegrating, and Yoko was an easy target. But here's the catch. John made the decision to bring her in. As Rodriguez says, you can say Yoko broke up the Beatles, but it was John who brought her in. So, was Yoko the reason, or merely a symptom of deeper issues? By 1969, the Beatles were on their last legs. The Let It Be sessions, designed to recapture their raw energy, became a pressure cooker. Cameras recorded Paul berating the band, infuriated by their lack of direction. John was drifting away, however, with Yoko at his side. Was Paul attempting to salvage the Beatles, or was he pushing too hard? The band pulled off one last masterpiece, Abbey Road, but even that was troubled. Paul wanted a medley on side B, but John just wanted a straightforward album. Then, in September 1969, John gave notice that he was leaving, but consented to keep it under wraps. Paul, tired of new manager Alan Klein and the band's bickering, broke the news in April 1970 with a press release accompanying his solo album, McCartney. The world was shocked, but for the Beatles, it was over. Was Paul's statement making him the villain, or was he simply telling the truth? Fans blamed Yoko for years. She was the outsider, the interloper who stole John and destroyed the band. But the reality is a little more complex. The Beatles were already falling apart. Epstein's passing, the use of drugs, and conflicting egos had all caught up with them. Yoko came along at a breaking point, and John's decision to put her ahead of the band didn't help. Paul, in particular, felt the sting. He'd lost his creative partner to someone he didn't understand or like. In a 2012 interview, he admitted, "I just hadn't liked her." Yoko's avant-garde art and bold personality clashed with Paul's structured melodic approach. Could Paul have accepted Yoko if she'd stayed out of the studio, or was their clash inevitable? The Beatles were over, but the melodrama wasn't. Following John's tragic assassination in 1980, Paul and Yoko's feud reached a new low. The biggest hot button? Songwriting credits. Paul wanted to change some to McCartney-Lennon, claiming it more accurately represented their work on specific tunes. Yoko dug in hard, claiming Paul was trying to rewrite history. Paul was damaging his own legacy, her lawyer said in a statement to the Los Angeles Times. Was Paul petty, or was he fighting for justice? The conflict wasn't merely credit-related. Yoko viewed herself as John's rightful partner even in death. Paul, having had a decades-long relationship with John, felt cut out once more. In Robert Rodriguez's words, it was a love triangle, complicated, unresolved, and emotional to the core. Could Paul and Yoko ever get over their past? Here's where the story takes a turn. Over time, Paul and Yoko started to mend fences. According to David Sheff's 2025 biography, Yoko, they had friendly visits. And by Yoko's 80s, their relationship was genuine, not just for show. In 2012, Paul publicly defended Yoko, saying she didn't break up the Beatles. In 2013, he called her a badass in Rolling Stone. Was this Paul letting go or just keeping the peace? But still, the wounds lingered. Paul never quite forgave Yoko, not for destroying the Beatles, but for what she stood for, the loss of his musical partnership with John. It was a reminder every time he looked at her of what might have been. While the Yoko drama played out, Paul never stopped creating. He formed Wings with his wife, Linda Eastman, and found solace in their love and family. Songs like Maybe I'm Amazed poured out his devotion to her. After Linda's death in 1998, Paul faced heartbreak again, but he kept going, later marrying Heather Mills and then Nancy Shevell, who brought calm to his life. Paul's music was always his therapy. Even the 1980 arrest in Japan for possession of marijuana, 9 days in a Tokyo jail, did not dampen his spirit. He conducted sing-alongs for prisoners and rebounded to continue creating. How did Paul remain so strong through it all? Paul McCartney and Yoko Ono's tale isn't one of feud, but of love, loss, and the complicated human nature of genius. Paul didn't despise Yoko for what she was, but for what she represented. The demise of the Beatles, the loss of John, and a partnership that revolutionized the world. Yet, in his 80s, Paul has come to a sort of peace, defending Yoko and moving on graciously. So, what do you think? Was Yoko the bad guy, or simply a woman who loved John when he needed it most? And could you ever forgive someone who altered your life forever? Drop your thoughts in the comments, hit that like button if you like this dive, and subscribe for more stories behind the music. Until next time, keep rocking, and I'll see you in the next video.